History Secrets.
In one of the most symbolic and dramatic passages of the New Testament, a scene appears that has crossed centuries of interpretation. A battle in heaven, a war between spiritual forces, and the fall of a great adversary. The account appears in the book of Revelation, a text known for its intense visions and deeply symbolic imagery. Revelation, chapter 12, verses 7 to 9, describes an unexpected conflict. There was a battle in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The text continues by stating that the great dragon was cast down to the earth. This dragon is identified as the ancient serpent, the one called the devil and Satan. This passage raises a question that has intrigued theologians, historians, and readers throughout the centuries. What exactly does this war in heaven represent? Is it a literal description of a spiritual conflict that occurred before human history, or a symbolic vision of forces that oppose the divine plan? To understand this episode, we must first understand the context in which the book of Revelation was written, a period marked by persecution, religious tensions, and a deep expectation of transformation. To understand the vision of the war in heaven described in Revelation, it is important to observe who the author of this book was and under what circumstances he wrote. Revelation is traditionally attributed to John, a Christian who lived at the end of the first century. According to the introduction of the text itself, John was on the island of Patmos when he received the visions that would form the content of the book. Revelation, chapter 1, verse 9, mentions that he was there because of the testimony of Jesus. Many scholars understand that this period coincided with moments of tension between the Roman Empire and the Christian communities. In this context, the book of Revelation uses highly symbolic language. Visions, mysterious creatures, cosmic battles, and dramatic images appear throughout the entire narrative. These elements are part of a literary style known as apocalyptic literature. This type of literature was relatively common in the Jewish world of the time. It used intense symbols to convey messages about spiritual conflicts, historical crises, and the hope of divine intervention. Within this style, the war in heaven described in chapter 12 represents more than a simple physical confrontation. It expresses a spiritual reality, a tension between forces that represent order and chaos, between faithfulness and rebellion. But to better understand the meaning of this celestial battle, we must observe the central figure of this conflict, the adversary described in the text, the great dragon. At the center of the vision presented in Revelation appears a figure described through a series of powerful images. The text speaks of a great red dragon, a symbolic creature that brings together various ancient traditions about evil and opposition to the divine plan. Revelation chapter 12, verse 3, describes this dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. On its heads were diadems. In the symbolic language of apocalyptic literature, these images often represent power, authority, and influence. But the text itself also clearly identifies this figure. Revelation chapter 12, verse 9, states that the great dragon is the ancient serpent, the one called the devil and Satan, the one who deceives the whole world. This identification creates a direct connection with a much older image, the serpent mentioned in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 3 describes the episode in which the serpent speaks with Eve in the Garden of Eden. Throughout the history of Christian interpretation, many theologians came to associate this serpent with the figure of Satan. Although the Genesis text itself does not make this identification explicitly, this association became especially strong in later traditions. Thus, the vision of Revelation brings together different symbolic images that developed over time within religious traditions. The ancient serpent, the spiritual adversary, the dragon that opposes the kingdom of God. But the narrative does not present only this figure. It also introduces the leader of the heavenly forces who rise against him, Michael. Within the vision described in Revelation, a figure emerges who plays a central role in the celestial battle, Michael. The text presents Michael as the leader of the forces that remain faithful in heaven. Revelation, chapter 12, verse 7, states that Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. This is one of the few biblical passages that explicitly describes a conflict between celestial beings. The figure of Michael already appears in earlier texts of the biblical tradition. In the book of Daniel, he is described as a great prince who protects the people of God. Daniel, chapter 10, verse 13, mentions Michael as one of the chief heavenly princes. Later, Daniel, chapter 12, verse 1, presents him as the guardian who rises in times of great distress. These references indicate that Michael was seen as an important figure within the celestial hierarchy, a defender, a protector, someone associated with divine order. When Revelation describes Michael leading the angels against the dragon, it draws upon this tradition. The conflict presented in the text is not merely a physical battle. It represents the opposition between two spiritual forces. On one side, those who remain aligned with the divine purpose. On the other, those who rebel against that order. This idea of a celestial rebellion also appears in other ancient religious traditions, but its most well-known form within the Christian tradition was constructed from the combination of several biblical texts and later interpretation. The idea of a rebellion among the angels does not appear in a fully detailed way in a single biblical text. Instead, it developed over time through the combined reading of different passages. One of these passages, frequently associated with this tradition, appears in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah, chapter 14, verse 12, contains a phrase that became very well known. How you have fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to the earth. This passage originally forms part of a discourse directed at the king of Babylon. In the historical context of the book, the text appears to be a metaphor about the fall of a powerful ruler who had exalted himself excessively. But throughout later Christian tradition, many interpreters began to associate this image with the fall of Satan. The expression morning star was translated into Latin as Lucifer. This word means bearer of light. Thus arose the idea that Lucifer had originally been an exalted being among the angels, someone who rebelled against God and was ultimately cast out of heaven. It is important to note that this interpretation is not explicitly developed in the text of Isaiah. It was constructed later through the combination of different traditions and theological readings. Among these interpretations, another passage frequently mentioned in this debate also appears, a fragment from the book of Ezekiel. Another passage often associated with the idea of the fall of a celestial being appears in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel, chapter 28, presents a discourse directed at the king of Tyre. In this text, the ruler is described using extraordinary imagery. The prophet states that he was in Eden, the garden of God. He was adorned with precious stones, and he walked among stones of fire. These images are clearly symbolic. Within the original context, they seem to represent the greatness and pride of a ruler who believed he possessed absolute power. But, as happened with the text of Isaiah, later interpreters began to see something more in this passage. Some theologians saw in this description a possible indirect reference to a spiritual being who had exalted himself, someone who occupied a high position, but who was eventually cast down because of his pride. Ezekiel, chapter 28, verse 17, states that the heart of this figure was lifted up because of his beauty, and that he was cast to the ground. These images ended up being incorporated into the tradition that speaks about the fall of Satan. Thus, over time, several different texts began to be brought together within a single interpretative narrative. The idea of an exalted angel, a celestial rebellion, and the expulsion of that being from heaven. But the vision of Revelation adds an important element to this tradition. It describes the moment when this expulsion becomes definitive. In the book of Revelation, the war in heaven marks a decisive point within the symbolic narrative presented by John. Revelation, chapter 12, verse 8, states that the dragon and his angels did not prevail, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The text then describes the expulsion of these forces to the earth. This image represents the definitive defeat of the adversary in the celestial realm, but at the same time, it introduces a new tension. Revelation, chapter 12, verse 12, declares something striking. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you with great wrath, knowing that he has little time. This phrase reveals an important aspect of the apocalyptic vision. Although defeated in heaven, the adversary continues to act in the human world. The narrative suggests that the spiritual conflict does not end with the expulsion. It is transferred to the earth. This idea deeply influenced Christian theology throughout the centuries. Human history came to be seen, in many traditions, as part of a broader spiritual conflict, a conflict between forces that represent faithfulness to God and forces that oppose that order. But within the biblical literature itself, there is also a deeper reflection on the meaning of this struggle. It does not occur only in invisible dimensions. It also manifests in human decisions. When we analyze the war in heaven within the broader set of biblical traditions, we perceive that it can be understood on different levels. On one hand, the vision of Revelation describes a spiritual conflict between celestial beings. Michael and his angels confront the dragon and his forces. This scenario conveys the idea of a rupture in the order of the spiritual world. But many interpreters also observe that the book of Revelation uses deeply symbolic language. The images of the dragon, the battle, and the expulsion may represent something broader. They may reflect the conflict between good and evil that runs through human history itself. During the period in which Revelation was written, Christians faced political pressure and persecution. In that context, the image of a celestial battle could convey hope. It suggested that, despite present difficulties, evil would not have the final victory. This interpretation transforms the vision of the war in heaven into a message of spiritual resistance, an affirmation that divine justice will prevail, even when circumstances seem unfavorable. At the same time, the narrative also preserves a mystery. It does not describe all the details about the origin of the rebellion of the angels. Instead, it presents only fragments of a larger story that develop throughout religious traditions. When we bring together all these passages, we perceive that the tradition of the war in heaven was constructed from different texts and interpretations over time. The book of Revelation presents the most direct image of this conflict, Michael and his angels confronting the dragon and his forces. But other biblical passages contributed to expanding this narrative. Texts such as Isaiah and Ezekiel were interpreted by many theologians as possible echoes of the fall of a being who exalted himself beyond his limits. Throughout the centuries, these readings were combined and formed the tradition known today. The story of a celestial rebellion, the fall of Satan, and the emergence of a spiritual conflict that runs through all human history. Perhaps the deepest aspect of this narrative lies in its symbolic character. It does not speak only of angels or of distant events in the spiritual world. It also reflects a reality that manifests within human experience itself. The tension between pride and humility, between faithfulness and rebellion, between destruction and restoration. These themes appear repeatedly throughout biblical traditions, and they continue to provoke reflection even today. Thus, the war in heaven described in Revelation remains one of the most powerful visions in religious literature, an image that invites the reader to contemplate the mystery of spiritual conflict and the meaning of the decisions that shape the destiny of humanity. History never reveals all its secrets. Between ruins, forgotten manuscripts, and lost civilizations, there are still questions that challenge everything we think we know. Perhaps some answers have already been found, but many others remain hidden. Subscribe to the channel and continue exploring the deepest mysteries of history. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.